It's past 10, and we are just over 316 people on the call, so I think we can begin.
Wonderful. Great, thank you, Tove. Brilliant. So welcome everyone once again to another very exciting iTOOsday, which is really an African topic, but very important for South Africa as well. And once again, we're joined by Professor Lyal White, who founded Contextual Intelligence. So he joins us in the room, and Ryan van der Kulbeck, who a lot of you know very well. Lyal's becoming a bit of a regular, and so kind of part of the furniture. So thanks to Lyal again. And he's going to share some insights and kind of some outcomes from a detailed research piece that they did on Africa's post-pandemic economic recovery. And very specifically, the pandemic exposed 5 pivotal issues globally, which I think Lyal touched on in our May session very briefly, but we'll go into a lot more detail today. And then Ryan and I will respond with kind of some high-level thoughts on our model in Africa and how that addresses some of those challenges, not all of them, and focus a little bit on cyber as one of those risks as well as opportunities, and then hopefully have some time for Q&A. Certainly have time for Q&A. So let me just share the presentation that Lyal will start talking to, and then over to Lyal. Everybody can see that. Presentation. So can you see that?
Yes, but please put it in presentation mode. Okay, wait, it's coming. It's coming.
Okay.
Still not in presentation mode, Dale.
Okay, it's on our side. Let me, the second last time as well. Let me try.
Sometimes if you go out, you go back in again. It's just, it lags.
Perfect, Dale.
Okay, cool.
Well done. Great. Can I take it away? Thank you very much, Dale. Ryan, wonderful to have you as part of our inner circle, as they say. Thank you very much for inviting me back. I always enjoy these conversations with iTOO and specifically with Dale. I think what Dale touched on there is that, what we're going to share with you today are some of the findings, the results of an in-depth academic research exercise or applied research exercise. But the reason why we're actually sharing this on an iTOOsday, and I like to be part of the furniture on iTOOsday because it helps us unravel some of the conversations, but is that when I shared some of this research with Dale, what is always interesting in putting into the context, especially with iTOO, is to look at the practical relevance. And we always come back to the expertise on the ground and what the relevance of some of these topics that we are doing academically are, what the relevance is in the practical day-to-day lives. So what my role is, I'm just going to really provide the introduction of some of the themes. I do want to share some of the outcomes. I must add that we've now also developed a shorter, because this was a 100-page report that we published with Columbia University. They've actually got centers of excellence there that we worked with around these governance and pandemic responses. But Columbia University, it was also part of a massive project that was funded by the Schmitz Futures Foundation. So that involved about 100 researchers around the world looking at different regions, and that involved a number of academics from Harvard and Columbia and other prestigious academic organizations. And then obviously the other partner organization, and I need to mention it because it's the South African one, was the Reponses Foundation, which was the South African partner on this, and then along with the association or the Academy of Political Scientists in the United States. So this was the title of the report, but the title today is let's not give up, let's catch up. So catch up and don't give up is one of the things, and it's because of what the results are now with the luxury of kind of hindsight where Africa is in terms of our response. So Dale, let's look at the first kind of introductory slide. I know these are heavy slides, and if you're very, very kind to the people, to the wonderful people at iTOO, that I'll share some of these slides with you, and you can just mull over them. But this is intentionally quite heavy because this just gives you some of the background. 2 years, it's actually 2.5 years now since the pandemic struck. let's not forget that the first confirmed case in Africa was in Egypt. I'll come back to this, but Egypt was one of the 5 countries that we looked at in this report. I'll go into the methodology and why we chose those 5 countries in a minute. And obviously, it's had a much more profound and lasting impact in Africa. The economic and the political state of each country. And this is something that Dale and I have been talking about, especially also in the context of a war economy now and the impact of these massive global events and the lasting impact they're having on the African continent. And I must say that it was the pre-pandemic state of the economy and the political environment that ends up either having more of an impact or accentuating certain global issues. And I'm going to speak to that in some detail. And that's why we brought some of the experts into the room as well, so they can actually speak to those as well, because it's, we need to look at where we came from to understand why we're responding in a certain way, or maybe why it's taking so much longer in certain countries to bounce back and to actually achieve some type of pre-pandemic growth. One thing that is important, and this is the sharp contraction in GDP in Africa. We are reminded that in 2020, I've got the numbers in front of me here, in 2020, the African economy, sub-Saharan Africa, I must add, contracted by 1.7%. That's according to the IMF. The global economy had an economic decline, so they didn't go into negative numbers, but they just declined by about 3%, or contracted by, not contracted, but the economic growth slowed down to about 3%. So Africa in negative numbers, 1.7, global 3%. In 2021, this is the moment of rebound, the bounce back and growth, and we would have expected the high numbers here. Africa in the region, as you see there, 3.7%. I think the more recent figures are 3.6%. They're normalized, but the world was around 5.9 or 6%. So again, still behind the rest of the world. And being an emerging market or emerging region, we would have expected higher growth rates in the bounce back. And then in 2022, these are projected numbers. We're looking at 3.8% for Africa. I would still say pretty much lackluster growth, and nearly 5% for the rest of the world. These are important because it gives us an indication of how Africa is bouncing back. There are some that say that in per capita terms, per capita GDP in Africa will only catch up or will resume those same per capita numbers of pre-pandemic by 2025. In other words, the average wealth of individuals will reach the pre-pandemic levels by 2025. So that's really quite a long lag time. So it's a very, very significant one. That last point there, per capita GDP will only recover those pre-crisis levels by 2025. So those are important key points. I just want to I wanted to speak to this slide in a moment, or right now, just to remind us of important issues that we raised in the previous iTOOsday discussions back in May. We always obsessed with the black swans, and in that discussion we spoke about the grey rhinos. Just as a reminder, the black swans are the unknown unknowns, and how we prepare for those, nobody knows. And we have so much and endless conversations about the unknown unknowns, and forget about the known unknowns that are literally knocking at the door and are going to be the result of things like pandemics, global changes, wars around the world, and all these other things that are taking place, these externalities that are going to impact us. We call those grey rhinos because those are definitely things like demographics, things like formal economic sectors, things like maybe the impact that we are seeing in other export markets or places for supply chains in terms of import zones. So those are the grey rhinos, but what we've used here are, we're often missing, for example, the elephant in the room. What are we missing or not seeing? And so we often just see part of that elephant, and it's an ongoing thing that we are reminded of constantly. The black swans are the unknown unknowns. I see that we're loading up here, so I'm not sure whether we've lost it. Okay, we're still online there, thank you. And then obviously the biggest problem that we have also is dealing with chaos. So that last one around, those happen to be jellyfish, by the way, on the edge of the screen there. And so when we're trying to deal with crises and managing the crises, I think that's something that's become a reality that we're all trying to deal with at the moment. And I think these are important when we start thinking about global events, systemic events, so it's a much bigger systemic thinking, and where Africa fits into the systemic responses to those. I think before I go into the slides, two very, very important two very important points that I'd like to raise and outcomes from the report that are not in the slides, and then we'll go into it. Obviously, the pandemic exposed and accentuated a number of issues globally, but nowhere was this more severe and more immediate. And I emphasize more immediate than in Africa, undermining and even reversing a couple of decades of progress that we've seen. So that's a very, very important point. But I want to actually emphasize that we are sitting in a room and within an organization that always looks at the positives and really does work towards these in a very constructive and pragmatic way. I strongly believe, and I like to believe that both Ryan and Dale are on board with this because we constantly work at this, that the pandemic actually could become a catalyst for, I would say, maybe a restart for positive change, but to accelerate and drive new areas of not only shifts and changes, but innovations, and bringing citizens and investors much closer together. But I would also like to say that in terms of the policy space, it could maybe inject a sense of urgency in the policy space. I do believe that some countries have adopted this. The results of the research suggest that, and we'll speak to that. Now, just going to the research, let's maybe look at the next slide. Sorry, it's another very heavy slide, but this gives you the kind of the perimeters of the research, what we looked at. So yes, it was an Africa-wide study, but we only took 5 countries. There are 5 very, very big countries. There are 5 anchor countries in their respective regions. Those being obviously Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. They comprise 40% of Africa's population and make up 60% of GDP. So they are highly relevant. Incidentally, the average, in terms of the demographic trends, nearly 70% of the population in these countries is under the age of 30. Obviously, Ethiopia driving that predominantly. These are obviously leading countries in their respective regions. I think what is also important is that given their size, they do represent general trends across Africa. They offer instructive lessons and experiences specific to the continent and relevant to global developments in general. And now what we did find was what were these 5 pervasive issues. We'll go on to it in a second, Dale, but just to flag them very quickly. Inequality, we obviously this was paramount, or this was evident around the world, but poor healthcare was more evident in Africa than anywhere else with subpar educational systems, and we're going to touch on that in terms of the 5 trends. Inadequate data, poor connectivity and access to information was also very, very concerning, and then high levels of informality, and we're going to be talking about the informal sector and ways of how to bring informality into the formal sector, because that is something that we want to try and look at. And these have defined the state of underdevelopment that have been held, that Africa has held for decades, but we were making inroads into this, chipping away at that. So that's what the research really covered. They also determined the path of recovery, or these issues have determined the path and the pace of recovery for the future trajectory. So I think with that, let's look at what these 5 areas are. And just looking at the time, what we are going to do is we're going to spend a bit of time on each of these. And as I do it, I'm going to bring in the kind of the practical experts, the people that are operating on the ground, and just give those give it some kind of practical life. So the pandemic, as I said, exposed and accentuated these 5 pivotal issues and the impact that they've had. Let me go through these very, very quickly. The first one was pervasive inequality. Now, what I mean by that is COVID-19 will go down, and I think I mentioned this in one of the talks in May. COVID-19 will go down as the single biggest contributor to deepening inequality at a global scale and at all levels. And what I mean by global scale, around the world, countries will become more unequal between countries, citizens will become more unequal. Organizations, the rich organizations or the wealthy organizations have become wealthier, and we've seen this in terms of the numbers. And the ones that were struggling have confronted greater challenges in the process. Poorer people got poorer, richer people got richer, as simple as that. So in per capita terms, per capita income declined dramatically around the world, and especially in Africa. Mostly, incidentally, and I know that there's a number of South Africans on this call, so mostly in South Africa, per capita income was hammered through the pandemic. We saw a 7.7% decline in working hours across Africa, and an increase of about 29 million jobs, nearly 30 million jobs, I would say, and this was actually only at the end of 2021. Nearly 30 million jobs were lost around Africa. This resulted in protests and looting that we saw here in South Africa in 2021. It's nearly a year since then, or was about a year since then. And obviously the pandemic, and because of this pervasive inequality, the most vulnerable and the most were disproportionately affected. And obviously those include people in the informal sector, women and children, etc. Food prices increased as a result. This was notable mostly in Nigeria, where poverty numbers increased dramatically in Nigeria. So those of you working in Nigeria need to be mindful of this, where they estimate that between 2020 and now 2030, there's going to be 16 million more poor people or people suffering from poverty in Nigeria alone. So those are big numbers. Kenya, incidentally, and I mentioned the countries quite intentionally because each one reacts differently. Kenya, already a deeply unequal, potentially or possibly one of the most unequal countries on the continent in the world. They saw the extremely wealthy were growing at a faster rate. So the wealthy grew faster, or the wealthy class grew faster than other parts of the world. But that meant that those that were left behind quite drastically. By the way, on the food price issue, you've seen now, you'll be reminded that we had Dr. Greg Mills speaking on the war in Ukraine and the impact on Africa. Africa now, like the pandemic, is seemingly the most impacted region of all regions around the world as a result of the war in Ukraine. And this goes back to food security, it goes back to the use of what Russia is turning food into a weapon, or it's weaponizing food, as they say. And obviously the impact of food shortages and the increase in price of food will impact Africa first, ahead of any other region around the world. So this is quite interesting because Greg did mention that the war in Ukraine will impact Africa first and foremost and have a more profound impact going forward. The second issue, lack of statistical data, I call it the data deficit. Hard, accurate, and reliable numbers are the foundation of policy decisions and investment choices in Africa and as in other parts of the world. One consequence, the full extent, and the one consequence of this is that the full extent of COVID-19 in Africa is largely still unknown. We don't know how impactful it was. We don't know the sheer numbers or the complete numbers. We don't even know how many people were actually vaccinated through the whole vaccination drive. And this obviously suggests Africa has not yet been badly affected when you read some of the commentary, but in fact, it was affected much more severely than most believe. There's underreporting that we saw. The most notable example was in Nigeria, underreporting, and the national consensus. And so the numbers, whenever you see numbers, and if you're looking at this and trying to dig around in certain countries when you're trying to get a localized flavor, look at when last they ran a census. In the case of Nigeria and Ethiopia, they last ran proper census. What's a plural census? Censi. Census easy. Some 15 years ago. And by the way, 15 years ago, that was only the third time in Ethiopian history. This is the second most populous country in Africa. 15 years ago, that was only the third time in Ethiopian history that they had done this. Half of Africa's population has not yet been counted, or has not been counted, sorry, since 2009. And remember, that's now 13 years ago, and in that decade between 2010 and 2020 was a massive growth period in Africa. Over half of Africa has not been counted. So I don't know if we want to talk about the data ones yet, or we should go on to the connectivity and digitization. If there's any comments.
I mean, just quickly on the data one, it's interesting and kind of Lyal touched on it on the contextual session, the last one around building relevant data for Africa. And I think for us, it plays out in our space, in the specialty insurance space, as well as things like marine engineering, where, you know, particularly in Africa, there isn't the same level of kind of data track record as there is in South Africa or Europe or the US. You know, many of our products are new, they're emerging risks, they're new needs that we're starting to sell in these markets. And so for us, the best way to build that knowledge is, and those data points, right, pricing, what claims could be, is by being on the ground, which we often say is kind of local is best. We'll touch on it just now, but I think it's a good example. You know, we can use South Africa as a proxy, which I think is wrong, or build country by country kind of approach to building correct pricing, how Ryan prices a risk in Namibia should not be the same as Kenya. So it's a journey we're on. We haven't arrived, but it kind of talks to your point today and previously, I think, around either do it yourself or you make other assumptions, and we're kind of doing a bit of both, but certainly local, on the ground, we find the most relevant.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, and what Dale's reminded me of is, in Africa, unfortunately, given the dynamics, given the history, we just don't have the luxury of being able to rely on conventional reports and often on secondary kind of research and data. You have to be there. You have to have a presence. You have to have a presence on the ground. And organizations like iTOO and many others have to generate your own data. And that's why it actually helps to have those expertise. I must admit at this stage, academics like myself or consultants that operate in the space do actually rely on the data that is generated by organizations that are on the ground. And that's why we do collaborate very, very closely with many of these corporates operating across the continent. And we want to start generating our own insights and data from those experiences. So I think it's very, very important. And the pandemic exposed this. We've spoken about it. It was Morten German and we spoke about this in one of the previous talks, that he wrote a book, it's nearly 10 years ago. We spoke about poor numbers and the lack of information and data. And that is still very, very clear today. And we've got a lot of work to do you must remember, we use data to inform our decisions, be it investments, be it policy making, or be it entry strategies into various locations across the continent. And in terms of the specific fit for purpose products that we design for those particular locations. I don't know if Ryan, if you want to say anything on, or shall I move on, or if there's anything on that particular point?
I think you guys have covered quite a lot of it. In particular, I want to raise the point on the policy making. So how do policymakers go about making policies without that real tangible data? Yes, you can have a feel if you're on the ground, but it's still a feel. It's not really as objective as if you've run a census and generated that data properly. I think we're living in a time where it's really a digital and a data economy, and having information which you can use for companies to target marketing, to develop and design products, to tackle and address issues is absolutely pivotal. And I think for Africa to really leapfrog and get ahead and catch up, having that sort of tangible data becomes imperative.
Yeah, and to add to that, then you have to rely on those organizations, those individuals, but especially those organizations that will give you the right and the most recent or current data and the most comprehensive data. Interesting, because this flags another point that one of my little areas of interest or bugbears is the role of business. The role of business in Africa is going to be in helping to generate that data and that information going forward. Whereas other parts of the world, this might be something that is generated by statistical houses, NGOs, and obviously governments. So that's all departments of statistics. So very, very interesting.
Maybe so just one point.
No, of course.
Just as an interesting sort of aside thought, not to derail completely, but we're probably in a position now where you'll find that these big sort of data collection organizations, the likes of Google, Meta, all of these guys have more insights into what's going on and what's actually happening in their country from these sorts of numbers than what most governments would. And that's not just a third world issue. I reckon you'll find that in first world countries like the US, etc. as well.
Yeah, so what is quite interesting from this is for me, it might be a bit of a difficult question or a difficult point to talk about, is how willing organizations are going to be to share that data. And that's going to be a discussion that people have within organizations, because there's obviously data sensitive and we've got to be sensitive to citizens. But I think it's also important for us to develop kind of some type of foresight to have accurate data as we build those. And Africa, once again, is one of those. And that's what makes working on the continent so interesting. There's never a dull moment, because you never know what's around the next corner, because we don't have this predictability around that is informed by data. But that's why we're going to start generating that to help us make better decisions. Very, very interesting. Okay, so the data deficit is going to be an ongoing issue, and how we actually do that. Now, the third point, the ability of African countries to connect to the digital economy. Ryan actually touched on this right now. You must remember, right, one of the biggest growth areas that I've been working on with a number of other companies is the development of data centers and how we are actually consciously, and it's becoming a human right to make sure that each and every African is connected. We're going to come back to the education side of things, but I think the thing that precedes everything is going to be connectivity. How do we ensure that Africans are connected to the digital economy, but connected to themselves. And that will obviously also be driven by price sensitivity and things like that. And it's very, very, very much, it's very different from one country and one market to the next. So just one or two high-level points around this connectivity and digitization, and then maybe my colleagues here would maybe contribute to this. But some of the points, so the movement of goods, services, capital, information, and people is still extremely low in Africa. If you look at what they call not inter-regional, intra-regional movement of goods, services, capital, people, etc. Africa, despite the All-African Free Trade Agreement, despite all these rhetorical kind of talk shops and all the rest, it's still at very, very low numbers. And when I say low numbers, you know, the likes of Latin America, obviously Europe is very, very high, in the 40s and 50s% in terms of the movement of goods and services. Africa is around the 15% level, maybe 18% level now, but it would have dipped through the pandemic. What we are obviously seeing is now we also have the digital kind of issue, and that was always not, that was never measured as in the intra-regional movement. The pandemic exposed infrastructure deficits. We all know about these, and the need for real integration. So there's a lot more urgency now, and you can see politically, people are much more motivated, or our leaders are much more motivated to talk about Africa-wide regional integration. But I also think, coming back to companies, we need to actually play a role in regional integration and initiatives across the continent. Because in the end, that is, these are going to be the tangibles that are moved, or the information that is moved between borders. This has prompted the importance of self-sufficiency in key strategic areas. So what I mean by it's prompted the self-sufficiency, it comes back to the vaccines and generating vaccines and moving vaccines and these types of responses across the continent. There's a lot of talk right now related to this in developing a bioeconomy across Africa, where we can actually, because you must remember that pre-pandemic, there were just one or two locations where you could develop in-house, Africa in-house vaccinations. And now it's going to be a real need as we prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. I know Ryan's going to talk a little bit about preparing ourselves for the next pandemic, so I'm not going to preempt that in any great detail. In terms of the digital connectivity, South Africa, obviously, this is just going back to the countries that we looked at. South Africa seems to be the most expensive in terms of our connectivity in dollar terms. It's high cost but good coverage in South Africa. And then if you look at the other side of the spectrum of those 5 countries, remind us, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Ethiopia is, I think this is quite obvious to everybody that's been traveling around the continent. Ethiopia is probably has the worst coverage in terms of our connectivity. But the cost is still 10%, and Kenya, by the way, is 3% of gross national product for 1.5 gigabytes of data. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot in terms of in real terms, but in terms of the income of individuals, is extremely high and extremely exclusionary when you look at these markets. So it's inaccessible to the masses in both Kenya and in Ethiopia, as an example. And let's not forget about the urban-rural divide in places like Kenya. We always look at Kenya and we understand, and I know there's a number of people that might be calling in from there right now, or that are operating there on a daily basis. And you'll know this, that there has to be a very, very clear distinction in our understanding of connectivity in Nairobi versus other parts of the country. And we've seen this, that we do have to be a little bit more kind of contextually aware and mindful of the localization issues. So low penetration rates, we saw low penetration rates incidentally across all 5 of these countries, despite maybe parts of Kenya, parts of Nigeria, and certainly Egypt and South Africa as a whole having a relatively high connection rates. Should I speak a little bit to the future world of work, or do you guys want to talk a little bit about connectivity?
Yeah, I mean, it's always quite nice and fresh. So, I mean, just to jump in with 2 points from my side, I mean, Ryan will talk a little bit later on maybe some of the risks and so on, but certainly on the connectivity point of view, what we saw was an opportunity, actually. So you've touched on all the risks and the trends here, but what we found, you know, sort of 3 years ago, pre-COVID even, in Africa, in the markets we operate in, the corporates and the large commercial entities are quite well catered for in our specialist products, our specialist liability products. So they've all mostly got PI, broad form liabilities, cyber coverage. You know, the banks certainly do. D&O, financial lines, and the like. But kind of that mid-tier, small to medium sector was kind of unserved for various reasons. And I think what kind of COVID sort of led and maybe more access through our brokers was our brokers kind of driving this need to access SMEs and a smaller customer who needed specialist covers. Small lawyers needing PI, small accountants needing PI, small businesses needing cyber insurance, given going online. And so we had to then simplify our products because they were complex products for complex clients. And we had to kind of tailor products with our brokers in each market. They're different, they're priced differently. And we've seen a huge take up, for example, in our PI InstaQuote product, which is a one-page questionnaire versus 5 questions versus hundreds.
Yeah.
In specifically Botswana, Zambia, and Kenya, we're just seeing incremental growth in that space. Small but sustainable, and so that's a really good example for us around kind of taking the opportunity to access, with our key brokers, new customers that we didn't previously.
Ryan, one of the things that when Lyal speaks like this, I often think about bespoke approaches, not only, so it's also not in geography, but in terms of, but also fit for needs, fit for purpose, and customizing certain things. So anybody that's looking at this now, and I think we all know this because we're all operating on the ground, is that regardless of where you are geographically, I think the rule of thumb is it always has to be customized for that particular need. I know in the beginning it's quite difficult because you feel like you're almost customizing every single one. But there are few generalizations. So one of the other things that this research revealed is that, yeah, we're sketching out trends right now, but there are very few things that take place trends are interesting and important points of reference. But we do need to look at very specific issues and customize every single thing that we do to maximize our impact and to actually ensure that we are catering for the market adequately. It's a very, very interesting point, and we've seen that now in terms of that. Ryan, I don't know if you want to add anything to this or you want me to move on to the future.
No, I think maybe just talk on connectivity. So it's an interesting topic. So it's an area where I think we're seeing a bigger divide now. So a lot of the African countries are still beset with a lot of challenges from an infrastructure perspective. And just talking to South Africa, we've obviously seen all the challenges with Eskom being able to generate electricity. There's a view that the digital economy, in particular in the first world, has accelerated dramatically through COVID. It's been heavily adopted. We see it to a degree in other countries where you've got remote working, and I know we'll talk about the future of work just now. I think it's important that governments around the African countries look at a way in which they can enable the adoption of the digital economy, because there's so much being traded within this, in particular in the first world countries, that it's an opportunity to tap into that sort of megalith of funds and stuff like that to generate more wealth in country. If you look at countries which are technologically quite advanced, the likes of China, etc., it's because they've adopted digital and they've gone with development and technology, all of that being powered and driven by connectivity. And just to kind of link that into a point you made a bit earlier on about how there's more pressure on governments now from a policy perspective, I think we saw that play out with a spectrum auction where governments are going, well, that's obviously that's an example. We need to enable people to be able to access data at lower rates, and which is a lot more viable and economical for them, so that they can start developing this next sort of generation of workforce. In particular, if you're looking at Africa, where most people, and I understand that there are certain countries driving that, the workforce is under 30. These are people who are going to more likely be technologically advanced. So you need to enable these people so that they can seize the opportunities to having connectivity and the digital economy that comes with that.
Yeah, so Ryan's talking about the adoption rates really, and the adoption of the youth. So, and we're looking at around this room. I mean, my adoption rate is a lot higher or a lot quicker than Ryan's, as an example. So it's interesting when you see those demographics, and you obviously it's a daunting challenge to make sure that you meet the expectations and the needs of this youth bubble. You must also remember that we have to actually rethink about how we connect people, and the adoption. And what is fantastic when you look at the likes of Ethiopia and Kenya and others, that the adoption of certain technologies will be so much quicker than in more aging populations. And South Africa, unfortunately, is an aging population. And once again, that highlights yet again a different approach to those markets. Kind kind of a nuanced approach, if you like. So looking at the future of work, and as we motor on, because I'm mindful of time, the future of work on a continent beset by vulnerable informal businesses and jobs. That's kind of that point there. The future of work on a continent beset by vulnerable informal businesses and jobs. What I mean by that is, I'm just going to give some high-level numbers, and then I'm actually going to hand over to the experts, really. The informal markets, or the informal employment in Africa, as we know, is very, very high. We always look at like the picture that you're looking at right now, and we think it's completely informal. But in the likes of Kenya and Nigeria, the informal employment exceeds 80%. Can you believe it? It exceeds 80%. In the likes of Ethiopia, it's over 90%, well over 90%. The Mercato, or the Mercato, which is the markets, the biggest open air markets in Africa, is in Addis Ababa. Go visit it if you get a chance, just to get a feel of those places. And that's incredible. Over 90% of Ethiopians employed are employed in the informal sector. The pandemic prompted new technologies, innovative working and reskilling and upskilling of workers. But whenever they talk about how it's created a new world of work, and there's debates around the Great Resignation, back to the office, it will be very, very different in our African markets. And it's going to be different between South Africa, for example, and other surrounding Southern African countries. And then we even go further afield, just in terms of how we actually are managing our future workforce and productivity, and the back to the office kind of debate that I'm sure many of you are having. Ryan, I think maybe you can actually speak a little bit to this point.
So for me, there's a big linkage here between the future of work and then the connectivity you're talking about previously. So if you can't provide connectivity at a price point that makes sense, that is reliable, how can people work remotely? Then you've got to kind of bring them back in to the offices. There are challenges that come with that, from time spent in traffic, pollution, costs of things like fuel, etc. So maybe I keep this sort of like IT lens on all the time and lose a bit of focus on that. But I think connectivity, and I don't want to sort of jump the gun before we get to point 5. Again, we'll talk about connectivity as far as education is concerned. So the future of work, I think, has been positively changed to a degree by what we've seen through COVID. We were going through this transitioning process. If you look at a lot of the big corporates, where they were moving towards more flexibility, and I think COVID really, with the work from home lockdown measures, accelerated that dramatically. It will be difficult for companies to have staff back in the office 5 days a week if it is feasible for them to work from home. And I think there's a good balance to be achieved there. So companies will have to be dynamic. It will be a little bit of learning as we go along. And I like the point you're making early on about it needs to be fit for purpose. So what works in one region may very well not work in another, and we'll see those trends playing out as we go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to just speak to this next point on, because this is obviously something that is of keen interest to me personally, and it's something that I'm actually involved with directly, is access to inclusive and quality education. What we've seen in regions like Africa, I must state very, very clearly now, it's not only in Africa where we've seen poor levels of access to quality education, and how the pandemic has accentuated this, but how this could be a big kind of, there's a big red flag here, because this speaks to how we are going to compete in global markets and compete as a continent going forward, and why it is so urgent and pressing, not only for the educational institutions, not only for the educationists, but for anybody that is looking at the future of the workforce. And so one of the things that we've seen here, now just some high-level numbers and comments again, online education and reviewing data, curriculum and regulations around universal access to quality education has been prompted through this. So we speak here again to connectivity, how many people in primary, secondary, and tertiary or higher education had access to education. We know that COVID actually ended up closing down schools in Africa and in Latin America more than anywhere else in the world. More than anywhere. So the regions that required them to be open for more days were actually the regions that closed them down. So this set us back dramatically, and this has been documented quite extensively by the United Nations and others. And the impact of this we'll only see in the coming 5 to 10 years. But there is a way for us to address this directly, and I would say it's through like anything, that's through the entry of the private sector. How the private sector can come in now, provide certain connectivity, actually create this into, or build this into some type of business model, where education almost becomes an add-on, where we start developing edutech. And I know maybe it's almost kind of contradictory because we've spoken about the lack of connectivity, but edutech actually is an entire value chain that is brought along, and where we bring in partners for connectivity. We bring in partners from maybe the business sector or the corporate sector to build the business models, because let's face it, they know how to do it. And then you bring in the educationists to make sure that you upgrade and you create the assurance of quality. So those are through accreditation processes. Let's not stick with the old accreditation processes that are pushed onto us by the regulators in our governments. Let's look at what the accreditation processes are, speaking to the future world of work, so preparing our people for the future world of work. It still shocks me that we are that we are stuck in the old structures of conventional degrees, things that are not actually going to be used by the workforce in the coming not even in the coming 5 or 10 years. We always used to talk about the future as if it was something on the horizon. We're talking about preparing people that are skilled for right now. The other thing that is not that I'm speaking about kind of the bigger issue of education, but also immediate needs, the immediate needs of those that are unemployed or underemployed, or those that are coming into the workforce right now. And those are short courses, continuous learning, and that can all be done online and through asynchronized responses to education. It is a very simple thing to do, but it takes the combination of citizens, investors in the private sector, and the regulators. And I can say that, and we've spoken about the big ones like Google and all those others, they are making a go at it. But let's face it, you know this better than anybody else, Ryan. We know the context, we know the environment, and those big ones that come in can provide perhaps the curriculum and the content, but they don't know the actual context and the continents and the locations and the difficulty. So those are things that we've got to think about. But I think education could become one of those things that we used to speak around in terms of the pandemic, but we didn't address it. And it's about time now that we address it quite intentionally. So that, and obviously, like I said, some of the big things are we need reform and we need to disrupt it. And the private sector can play a big role in that, in turning this into a business itself. Okay, I think let's...
Yeah, maybe quickly on that, and then I'm going to jump forward. We've got sort of 15 minutes left, which is great. And Ryan's got a couple of slides, which I think would be cool just to share. It's interesting, you touched on some of it. We'll skip over my one, I think, but just on, I mean, at a more macro level for us as iTOO, I think we invest a huge amount in training, of our brokers, our in-country partners, our in-country clients, and online has allowed us to do a lot, like an iTOOsday. Ryan, the amount of time Ryan and his team, or John O'Melita, our experts spend training different groups is exceptional, and it's a massive investment that is absolutely worth it to upskill all of our partners and stakeholders to kind of understand the nuances and the products and why they are required. And so I think that, what we've done there as well, which maybe Tove could share at the end, is build, so Ryan won't be in every country at once, is kind of 10-minute videos, which can be WhatsApp or emailed. So we'll certainly, for those who don't know, share those links. Those are very cool kind of 6 to 8 minute videos that summarize each of our 24 products, which you can check out before you see a client or show and send to a client. So that's again using technology, and it's cut through everything here. Actually all 5 points. So I think just thought I'd make mention of, yes, it's not dealing with the broader macro educational issue, but certainly at a micro level, it's bringing more people into the job sphere, creating more knowledge, and huge investment from our side in terms of what we can do. I mean, just quickly on, I'll go over this quickly. I think a lot of you have seen this, but really kind of the how we operate, I wanted to touch on today was really the 3 Ps. So partnering, local licenses, local brokers, local regulators, and local clients. We have to do that with guys who understand the local territory best. People and building expertise, and on the ground, Lyal spoke to, and products we spoke at length about tailoring product for an SME versus a corporate, and a Namibian versus a Kenyan. So I think that's a good segue then kind of into cyber, which is super topical and both as a risk and an opportunity. Ryan's got kind of just literally a couple of slides that I think will be useful to just share some thoughts before we open up.
Yeah. Just before Ryan does speak to that, I'm pleased that we're ending on, because what I've illustrated are the 5 trends that we saw. And I know some of you are sitting there going, yeah, but what about the food security thing? And then what about this? And Ryan came up here, and this is where cyber security can come in. And this is often like one of those, I have to admit, so I have to concede this one is like, or confess that this is one of those things that's a bit of a black box, and I'm worried, I'm like scared to kind of engage with it, but it's actually become such a massive issue, and to internalize and contextualize it within the African space is useful. So it's going to be interesting to hear what Ryan says about this and how and if it fits in with those trends going forward. So that's really cool. Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Awesome. So I think it was referenced that I was going to talk about the next pandemic towards the end of the presentation, and the sad reality is that cyber crime does have the propensity, if not already is, that sort of next pandemic. So if we looked at global economies, cybercrime, were it an economy, would be the 3rd biggest behind only the US and China. It's now more profitable than the global drug trade. There's a massive rising cost of cybercrime. And I think to tie this into what we've been discussing, researching, looking at the topic as to why is cybercrime so prevalent and why is it on the rise? There's a couple of core points that come out from you. One is that you see a lot of frustration from youth who are now a lot more technologically advanced. Yes, maybe these are people who've had more access to connectivity and developed the skills and the resource, but because businesses and economies have become quite staid in their thinking of, oh, well, you need to have 3 years experience before we'll give you a job and stuff. You've got very skilled resources that have now finished varsity. They are cybersecurity wise, or from a cyber technology perspective, very, very strong, but they can't get a job because they don't have 3 years experience. So now they become frustrated and they turn to cybercrime because it's an avenue that they can explore to generate revenue and funds. What that's created is also a massive skill shortage from a cybersecurity perspective, which again talks to opportunities to develop and train new skills and resources. I've got a 12-year-old daughter who's sitting at a school which is supposed to be very progressive, and she's busy doing technology as a subject. So, oh, amazing, what languages are you programming in and stuff? No, we're learning about levers and switches. I'm going, that's amazing. Need a pen and need a piece of paper. So I think there's a big challenge to companies and governments that we need to look at what we've done in the old way of operating and challenge those things. So if you're coming out and you've got good qualifications and your technology is strong, why do you need 3 years experience? Put the person in, give them learnership. Let's incubate and develop this talent. There's young workforces through Africa that need to be looked after and developed and trained up. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide on my side. If you want to skip to the next one. Maybe just to paint this ransomware picture a little bit, further as to why this is the next pandemic. So if we looked to 2021, this is a report that was done by Unit 42, the ransomware team, which formed part of Palo Alto, one of the big sort of firewall and technology security companies. They saw an 85% spike in victims compared to 2020. So this was coming through the pandemic where people were now financially, they were in a difficult position, they were frustrated, and they were leveraging technology to go and generate an alternative form of revenue. Not that I'm saying that this is what we should do to alleviate some of the challenges, but it shows that there's a lot of skilled technical people out there that we're not looking after and equipping, bringing them into more formal sort of workforces. And if we look to the African context, there's such an opportunity from an education perspective, the development of skills and technology, and to go and leverage the shortcomings that globally are being seen through trying to leapfrog. And maybe it's a bit romanticized from my side, but I feel that with the challenges we see on the continent around things like infrastructure and informal trade, etc., technology brings this leveler to the global economy that you can very quickly scale up and achieve massive things very fast to try and catch up, which is really the whole sort of topic that we're discussing this morning. Average demands we saw up by 144%, and if we look at the average ransoms that were paid, you're at 8.5 million rand, which these are massive numbers for companies to be losing out on. And important that companies are better protecting themselves, because while you're looking to develop these new skills, grow businesses, create new jobs, you can ill afford to have, an 8.5 million rand knock to your bottom line and be dealing with cyber incidents left, right, and center. So I think cyber is a developing pandemic, important for companies to to secure themselves, and pivotally important for us as a continent to develop those resources. We can then export them as well, and just empower our youth, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's really like a very specific area of that brings a lot of those trends together, because it's the education side and the activity side. But this is a specific example.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, that's the last.
And I don't think we need to talk to this slide really. I don't want us to make it all a focus on cyber. I think it'd be good to open up the floor for some questions.
Yeah.
With the 10 minutes to go.
Yeah. So there, I'll see if are there, while I'm busy and sharing, are there any questions that you want to kick off with?
I'm just quickly checking on the chat. I don't see anybody that's got a specific question. Ryan, you spoke about the young people that are coming in and that they're not finding jobs in terms of cyber because they don't have experience. On the chat, I posted a little 12-year-old cyber hacker. How do you see that as a risk when young people are experimenting with things and they actually turn out to be, well, they accidentally attack a company or accidentally put down your firewalls if you don't have enough of those? Like, is that something we should consider? Not necessarily the people who are qualified, but people who are actually just experimenting. You see lots of gamers around, lots of people who like trying different things with tech. Could that be a threat?
So I think it all boils down to what the intent of that individual is and what opportunities we're giving them. So there is a sort of thriving bug bounty sort of economy out there where companies will enlist the services of these sorts of individuals to see if they can break in. They will share the insights on how they've done it, and then they will pay them for that so they can secure it before it's exploited by an individual who's got malicious intent. So it all boils down to what their intent is, and what it highlights a lot in that is sometimes the traditional sort of degrees and things like that shape a person's thinking, and you become quite regimented in the way you look at challenges and opportunities. Whereas if you have the youth that have now come through and they've explored different things, they think differently, they can exploit different opportunities to gain access to these sorts of things, come up with different ideas, and we really do need to be a lot more open-minded to encouraging that and looking as to how that can be to their and everyone else's benefit.
Cool. And I mean, just adding on to that question, we see that crime in the natural form of crime, when there's like high unemployment and the economy is not doing well, that the crime rate normally spikes because people are trying to survive. Do you think that that's going to be the progression with cyber? We spoke about cyber war and how that's going to be a thing, but do you think that crime will also escalate as people get pressured, but if they've got a certain level of skills, they'll rather turn to cyber crime rather than normal crime?
We're already seeing it. So I mean, the stats that I showed with the spike in cybercrime, the ransom demands and stuff, that's evidence that we're seeing that play out already. There have been various studies that have highlighted this as a massive risk and a concern. So short answer is most definitely yes.
And maybe a question to Lyal, seeing as we are operating in the African context, and maybe we're not seeing the technology uptake, as you said earlier, as we're not transforming as quickly as the rest of maybe the first world or second world countries. Do you think that is more of a risk to us? Because if we are not as developed as the first and second world, we are therefore a little bit more exposed because we're not using sophisticated software and we're not catching up to the rest of what the world is doing.
I think that's a great question, actually, Tobe, and it's actually a question more for Ryan because he operates in this space. But I think he might agree that we're part of the global economy, so we're part of this massive movement, and if we haven't got the systems in place and we're not prepared for it, we can't really respond to it in adequate ways. So I'd say that, yeah, we are more exposed right now. We might be. I think we need to have a more kind of thoughtful response to these things. I think we need to start developing expertise on this in line or in keeping with the pace of change in the world. And we can't kind of think, oh, well, you know, Africa's disconnected, because this part will be connected a lot quicker than the rest. And we could be left behind, and it could actually expose us to certain vulnerabilities. I think, yeah, but like I said, Ryan, the beauty of this is that we can speak about this, or we can kind of wax lyrically on this, but Ryan actually operates in this on a day-to-day basis, and I would actually fire that question away to him.
Yeah, and I mean, just to maybe summarize, and I think you've answered really well, is the adoption of these sorts of technologies and connectivity and all the rest of it has the opportunity either to help Africa as a continent catch up with the global economies because they've adopted this and they're going at it full steam ahead, or the downside is if we don't and we carry on, I want to say plodding along, but that sounds horrible, we're going to fall even further behind. So there's a bit of a chasm that we need to try and sort of cross now. Otherwise, I think we're going to be in a worse position going forwards.
Yeah. So,
well, we do have sorry, man, we've got a question here from Thomas. He just says a question for Lyal.
Yeah.
With the impact of COVID-19 as the report highlighted, as well as the impending Ukraine-Russia war, is there a real risk of collapse in Africa, or does it have the ability to bounce back easier than the rest of the world?
So, great question there, Thomas. I think when you talk about Africa bouncing back, I need to just re-emphasize once again that recovery and response will not be any kind of conventional linear form in Africa. There are going to be some countries that literally bounce back and that are prepared, more prepared than others. Egypt has incidentally shown that they are better prepared, and some would have actually said that Kenya was too. We're going to be following now very closely the Kenyan elections now in August, and that's going to speak, Kenya and Ethiopia, given the conflict in Ethiopia. But those are countries that I would have hoped that would bounce back. But to give you a short answer, and I think maybe you should contact me for a nice cup of coffee where we can actually delve into these. I think Africa has got the ability to bounce back. I do think that there are major concerns. And one of the things, and what you've actually opened this up to, is why did we not include food security? Why did we not include migration and some of these other things that should have maybe been on the 5 trends? And they do actually come in. And I think that what the war in Ukraine has revealed is that Africa is increasingly exposed and vulnerable to global events, more so. And because we don't have the institutions and the systems in place to actually to manage our way through this. So I'm very, very deeply concerned actually around the food security issue. And I do think that the migration issue will be related to this. But having said that, I do think that we'll bounce back, but we won't bounce back as quickly as some of the other regions. Incidentally, Thomas, while we're on this topic, I do a lot of comparative work with Latin America. Latin America, obviously, with the oil price, was able to respond quite effectively, and obviously Brazil, mostly Brazil, but even Argentina were able to respond to the food crisis. But these were very short-term responses, and we see once again that stability in these areas, especially around fossil fuels or around oil prices and food, stability is actually what will create sustainable kind of growth and development for these regions. So we can't rely on short-term responses around that, and that's what I think is going to be for the African side of things. Yeah, there's a number of things a number of issues that are flagged around this. I mentioned migration, and I mentioned then the food security, and I think that does suggest that we need to talk about these things. One last point from my side, and when we look at these issues that Thomas has flagged or asked about, but also on the 5 trends, when you leave here right now, obviously there's going to be other trends, but think about those. Think about these 5 trends, and again, I'm going to repeat them very, very quickly for you, so that you can think about them in the context of your business and in the context of your operations, and thinking a little bit more kind of thinking a bit more about this in the day-to-day activities. Pervasive inequality, lack of statistical data or reliable data, the ability of African countries to connect to the digital economy, the future world of work, but in a continent that is beset by informal businesses, and why the future world of work might be different here, and obviously poor levels of and access to quality education. And then we've had a nice practical example here of maybe, as Ryan has in his doomsday kind of things that cybersecurity could be the next pandemic. Are we prepared for it? Have we got systems in place? I keep on coming back to institutions and systems, and we don't want to avoid systemic failure. But those things, I always think about, how does this impact me in my life and in my world of work? And that's why it's just simply a guiding kind of trends and reference points for us to look at.
That's a great way to finish, and we're kind of 2 minutes over, so apologies for that. But thank you everybody for joining. I think Toby has usual, we'll share the slides. They, I think they are useful. And yeah, please, if you have any questions or would like to have a coffee with Lyal or myself or Ryan, seems Ryan would be sort of first prize, but Lyal second.
It's all three of you, Dan.
Toby's done a poll in there, and we much better coffee consumers. Yes. I would also like to definitely see some of those short video clips because of my obsession around learning and training. I'd love to see some of those video clips. And the platform is so important. If you're able to distribute these on WhatsApp, I realize that WhatsApp is often a more workable and easier platform for us to use in Africa. So I'm really, really excited to see some of those. So please do share those, Toby.
Here's one for you guys. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Not playing.
Well, maybe you're going to have to WhatsApp it to us then. Yeah.
iTOO Special Risks is a special risks insurance provider operating as Harlard's preferred underwriter of specialty products. iTOO is a niche home for entrepreneurs, startups, and specialist UMAs. We believe understanding our customers, their businesses, and individual needs is what really sets us apart, sharpens our expertise, and broadens our service offering. Africa is one of the world's hot regions for insurance. Steady economic growth in most countries, combined with a largely underdeveloped insurance sector, have positioned the continent as the second fastest growing region for insurance globally after Latin America. According to McKinsey, prior to the impact of COVID-19, the insurance market was expected to grow at compound annual growth rates of 7% per annum between 2020 and 2025. While COVID has had a negative impact on economic growth in Africa, this impact is expected to delay rather than alter the pattern and potential of future growth. And in some cases, the crisis may accelerate existing trends, notably the shift towards digital and an increase in intangible risks, which has the potential to offer new opportunities. We build sustainable and high-growth businesses in selected African markets. Our focus is on underwriting specialist risks, and we aim to lead the market with our expert teams and products. We believe local is best. We develop local markets, local skills, and build capacity and partnerships. This approach is long-term in nature and is value-adding to all our local stakeholders. iTOO has developed joint venture partnerships with Harlard in Namibia, Botswana, and Mozambique, where we have dedicated experts on the ground. iTOO also partners with Harlard in Zambia, Lesotho, and Ghana. We have entered into a partnership in Kenya with a top insurer, which will focus on the East African region with an expert permanently based in Nairobi. These partnerships are all co-branded with iTOO as the product specialists and our partners as the local insurance licensees. In all our Southern and East African markets, plus Ghana, we have formalized reinsurance treaties in place, as well as facultative inward structures. iTOO's experts are responsible for all underwriting and claims in all our specialist liability and risks products. Why iTOO? 3 key differentiators: partnerships, people, and products. Partnerships. We have a strong partnership ethos and approach so that we can work with local experts and brokers to deliver world-class solutions to customers in each market. Each market in Africa is unique and special, and we want to learn and develop relevant solutions for each country in which we operate. People and talent. Unleashing expert talent in Africa is a major focus for us. This involves South African underwriters working in markets, as well as developing local insurer and broker expertise. Significant time and investment in training and education is made per country, focusing on specific products that are relevant and in high demand locally, resulting in better understanding of minimum underwriting information, risk appetite, and growth opportunities. Products. The aim is to grow specialist liability products and targeted or focused products where the market has a need and an ability to scale. Our focus with our JV partners has been on broad form liability, professional indemnity, medical malpractice, financial lines, mainly directors and officers, and cyber insurance. In addition, environmental liability, events liability, political violence and terrorism, and kidnap and ransom are growing products. Renewable energy is a core offering in the solar and wind project space. We also have funky products like drones, art and collectibles, and court bonds. Ultimately, these niche and highly technical products require expert underwriters to assist brokers and their clients in executing the best covers and service. iTOO plays across the entire continuum, from small to large customers and businesses. The major focus is on deliberately targeting the SME and small commercial sector, from simplified quoting to product. We partner with African brokers to roll out simple products through our InstaQuote products and digital platforms. For the commercial and corporate sectors, a good understanding of the industry in which the risk operates and knowledge on market trends relating to the risk is key, both for our primary and excess layers. Most risks fall below $1.5 million or 20 million Rand, and we are keen to go up to $5 million where the risk falls within our appetite, and we have received enough information to adequately underwrite the risks.
I think you guys get the idea. So these are all posted on our YouTube page, and they are also on the iTOO website.
Will be well underwritten and assessed.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks. Yeah, fantastic. That's great. Cool.
Thank
See
you.
next Tuesday.
I'm impressed that everybody stayed to watch. I thought we were only
Yeah.
caller.
Yeah, that's amazing. So
Thank you to everybody that stayed. These videos are all available on our website, and if you don't come right there, they're all on the iTOO YouTube page. And the broker consultants can WhatsApp them to you just to make things a little bit easier, and you can forward them on to your clients.
Okay. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Right.